Hi, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 7 of our class. Our time together is almost over, so we're almost done with all of our information. But for tonight's session, our primary topic is going to be leadership. And I am, again, aware that you've had an organization leadership course in the program not too terribly long ago. So I think this leadership information we can probably progress through relatively quickly. So I know there are a lot of slides here. I think there are 40 slides, but don't be daunted by that. I think we'll be able to get through it in a pretty quick manner. And then after we talked about leadership and its impact upon effectiveness, then the final topic I have is kind of a wrap up of the entire course, looking at some of the conditions that are necessary for making organizations effective. And so my goal tonight is to get through both of those topics. And if we can cover leadership and then also cover the wrap up I have for the course, that will then cover all of our information that we typically cover in a semester, and then next week, instead of having a Zoom session on Tuesday night, we just give that time back to you to use that time to work on your chosen solution paper. That is my plan. That is my hope if we can get through all the information tonight. If we're not able to get through all that information, then we might have to have a brief session next Tuesday. But I think there's a very good chance that we'll be able to get through everything just in tonight's session and give you next Tuesday then to work on finishing up your chosen solution paper. So what you have then left for the course is you have your chosen solution paper. And again, as you write that chosen solution paper, you can make it very brief because all you're doing is just telling me, here is the solution that I chose, or plural, the solutions, if you're going to choose more than one of your 3 alternative solutions. Here is what I chose to address the issue or the problem, and this is why it is the most appropriate way to address the issue or the problem. So again, I think in the syllabus, I say 3 to 5 pages. It could be a relatively short, very parsimonious paper. If you could, like you did on the alternative solutions paper, if you could just include a real brief paragraph at the beginning, just reminding me of the issue or the problem, and then tell me which of those solutions you selected and why you selected that solution or those solutions. So that's your chosen solution paper. I have given you some extra days to finish it up, and so it's not technically due until May 17th. So you have a few more days to work on it. And then for your final Canvas essay, all you're going to be doing is just distilling that into a discussion board post where you're sharing with your classmates, here's the solution or the solutions that I chose and why this solution or these solutions are the most appropriate ones in this situation for this issue or this problem. And then that's it. So just your final Canvas essay, your chosen solution paper, and then you are done with this course for this semester. So that's where we are. That's where we're going. We'll see how we do tonight. And if all goes well, then you'll be able to just work on your chosen solution paper then next Tuesday. In terms of, there's a question in text chat from Maria about, for the chosen solution paper, do we have to include references? No, you're not required to, unless those references were useful to you in justifying why you selected that alternative. And so if you do need to use references, you can, but you are certainly not required to do so. Okay, well, let's go ahead then and get into our leadership information. And in covering this information, what we're going to do tonight is I'll reintroduce you, because you've probably covered some of these theories before, but reintroduce you to some of these leadership theories with a focus upon what leadership then means for the effectiveness of organizations. And again, a lot of these theories you've probably seen before. Maybe some of these theories you have not seen before and are new to you, but to kind of link up this idea of leadership, leadership styles, leadership techniques, and organizational effectiveness. So you're all very familiar with what leadership is. You know that leadership oftentimes includes things such as the ability to induce compliance on the part of others, the ability to exercise influence, and power really is all about the exercising of influence, influencing people to do something they may otherwise not do. The ability to persuade, and several times throughout this class we have talked about the uniqueness of public organizations and how public leaders and managers need to oftentimes persuade because they have limitations and constraints based upon their ability to tell people to do something and expect them to do it. And so leadership's about the ability to persuade, the ability to achieve goals, as in our goal attainment model that we had talked about a couple of weeks ago. And really, leadership is a combination, oftentimes, of all of those different characteristics. So, with leadership, we're usually talking about the capacity of someone to be able to direct and energize people to achieve goals, oftentimes the goals of the organization. Now, in your organization leadership class, you may have talked about the difference between leadership and management. And there is a difference between leadership and management. And the primary difference between those two terms revolves around the use of resources, the allocation of resources. In managers tend to allocate resources in the organization. So management is usually directly connected to the allocation of resources. Leadership is not always connected to allocating resources. Sometimes it is, but it doesn't necessarily, by definition, need to be tied to the allocation of resources. And so that's kind of the difference between leadership and management. But recognizing that difference, we also need to recognize the fact that as we go through some of our theories tonight, we will sometimes use the terms interchangeably because the literature sometimes uses those terms interchangeably as well. But what I'd like to do tonight is just kind of take you through some of these more prominent theories that have attempted to answer the challenges of leadership, to give us a polemic, if you will, to kind of show us how leaders can be effective and the types of strategies leaders can exercise in order to make their organizations effective. Now, we know that decades ago in the leadership literature, the really first approach in the leadership literature was really oriented around what we call the trait-based approach to leadership. And the models really were looking for certain traits in individuals that led those individuals to become good, effective leaders. Things such as intelligence and foresight and personality characteristics such as enthusiasm and persistence were identified as those leadership traits that really enhance someone's leadership capability and capacity. What we do know, though, is as the literature has developed, we've kind of moved away from this trait-based approach to studying leadership a bit through the recognition that no single characteristic, no single attribute, if you will, distinguishes leaders from non-leaders. So essentially, it's not necessarily that people are born to be leaders. We can train people to be effective leaders. Hence the reason why we have organizational leadership programs that are popping up all over the country. And you can get your master's in organization leadership. You can get a PhD in organization leadership. One of my colleagues has her PhD from Minnesota in organization leadership, and she's teaching in an MPA program. Most MPA programs around the country have leadership courses. You had one in this program. The vast majority of programs either have leadership as a required course or as an elective course. So obviously there are some skills, there are some techniques that then can be taught to people to hopefully make them more effective leaders. When you look at the leadership literature dating back into the mid to late 1950s, you see that a lot of that literature is really oriented around this dichotomy that was created back in the 50s with the Ohio State studies. And Ohio State, you've probably heard about these before, but the Ohio State studies, Ohio State researchers used this leadership behavior questionnaire. And through this questionnaire, they were able to identify two dimensions that have continued to be used throughout the literature: a consideration for people and a consideration for task structure productivity. So on one side, we can measure the likelihood of someone to really be committed to caring about people, and their primary goal as a leader is to take care of people, to build a sense of fellowship in their organization. They have a high consideration for people versus other leaders who have a much stronger consideration for getting the job done, for task and for accomplishing tasks and for productivity. And really this people type of structure, task, productivity type of polemic has really followed us through the ensuing decades in the leadership literature. The University of Michigan in the early 1960s did a very similar study, kind of building off the Ohio State studies, again, looking at this dichotomy between concern for people and concern for task or productivity. So a good way to look at this concern for people versus concern for productivity is in this managerial grid that Hal provides for us that shows you different types of leadership or management styles based upon concern for people versus concern for production. So concern for people on the y-axis, ordinal ranking from a low of 1 to a high of 9. On the x-axis, concern for productivity, again, ranging from a low of 1 to a high of 9. So the worst situation to be in is impoverished management, impoverished leadership in that bottom left-hand corner. So these are leaders or managers who score low on concern for people as well as low on concern for production. In this impoverished management, effective production is unobtainable because people are lazy, apathetic, and indifferent. So this is very much your theory X approach to leadership, a la Douglas McGregor. Sound and mature relationships are difficult to achieve because of human nature, and conflict is inevitable. So that's obviously the place on the chart, the grid, where we want to try and avoid. Top left, that green cell is country club management, people who score high on concern for people, but low on concern for productivity. So in country club management, production is incidental to a lack of conflict in the creation of good fellowship. So the primary goal is to look after your people and create good fellowship among your employees. And if productivity suffers because of that, well, then so be it. Bottom right hand, that purplish type of cell is task management. These are leaders that score high on productivity, but very low on concern for people. They view people as commodities. They're just like machines, so kind of a la Frederick Taylor in scientific management. Managers' responsibility is to plan, direct, and control the work of those who are subordinate to them. So very much task orientation. Where we obviously would like to be is the top right-hand cell with the light blue category, light blue cell of team management. Production is from an integration of both task as well as human people requirements. And so these are leaders or managers who are able to integrate both a concern for productivity together with a concern for people. And so these are the managers and leaders who tend to be effective within organizations. And that's what we're trying to oftentimes strive for in most situations. Now, we also know that the literature tells us about situational leadership and how we oftentimes lead by situation, as Mary Parker Follett told us, that we lead based upon the contingency and the context of the situation in which we are facing. So sometimes you can be a little bit more country club, sometimes you're a little bit more task management, but overall you hope that you're able to integrate those two focuses together in order to achieve that team management, team leadership type of an orientation. Another theory that is an interesting one that you've probably learned about before is Fiedler's contingency-based theory. And Fiedler bases it upon this idea of the LPC, the least preferred coworker approach. And so in the least preferred coworker approach, we will have leaders rank and leaders evaluate the work of people that they would consider to be their least preferred coworker to work with. So think about the person you would least want to work with, your least preferred coworker, and then evaluate their performance. Some leaders, even though this is the least preferred coworker they want to work with, will still evaluate the performance of that person relatively high. That's going to be our high LPC types of leaders. They are the ones who are much more relation, people oriented. Other leaders and managers may give those employees, the least preferred employees, very low ratings. Those are our low LPC, our task-oriented types of leaders or managers. The importance here is that in certain situations, a high LPC approach to leadership works. In other situations, a low LPC approach to leadership may work a little bit better. So again, it's not a best, it's more of a what is most appropriate in that context of that situation. So what Fiedler found is that based upon contingencies, low LPC approaches tend to be relatively effective in very favorable or very unfavorable settings. And so it's a very favorable setting where everyone is getting along and tasks are clear and everything is well understood. Or if you're in the opposite end of the spectrum where people are not getting along, it's a very unfavorable setting. That's where we tend to see low LPC types of leadership orientations. In those intermediate situations, that gray area in between the most favorable and the least favorable situations, that's where we tend to see high LPC working. And in the public sector, we oftentimes work in that gray area in between the most favorable and least favorable situations. So that's when we oftentimes see that high LPC relationship, people oriented type of leadership being used. But again, both can work, but it depends upon the contingency. It depends upon the context of the situation. It depends upon the relationship that the leader has with their employees. It depends upon the clarity of the tasks that these employees are being asked to do. Are these tasks very clear? Are these tasks ambiguous and difficult to understand? The position power of the leader, how much formal power does the leader have, will also contribute to your decision as to whether you're more relationship oriented or whether you're more task oriented. But I like contingency theory because it really feeds in very well to, again, my favorite answer to everything, which is it depends. The appropriate leadership approach really depends upon the context of the situation in which you are facing as a leader. Now, that again moves us far away from this search for a magic bullet, this search for the single or the set of characteristics and traits that all leaders need to have and need to exhibit in every single situation. We talked about motivation, about Vroom's expectancy theory. And we talked about how Vroom's expectancy theory as a process-oriented theory could contribute to our understanding of the amount of effort that employees will put forth in doing their jobs on a daily basis. And when we talked about expectancy theory, we talked about these three different variables of valances, instrumentalities, and expectancies. Valence is the amount that someone places a value upon an outcome. So, getting time off or getting employee of the month is something they value. It has a high valence level with that employee. Instrumentality is a belief on the part of the employee that the leader and the manager is actually going to make good on these promises that if effort is achieved, this is the outcome that those people will receive. Expectancy, the confidence that an employee has that if they put forth this amount of effort, it will result in the accomplishment of this level of performance. So at the heart of this thing called path goal theory, we're basing it on Vroom's expectancy theory. And it's based upon this idea that the leader's primary purpose is to motivate their workers by clarifying goals and then identifying the best paths for those employees to achieve those goals. The better that employees can see a clear, distinct path to achieving the goals they're trying to achieve, the more motivated they will be to achieve those goals. And so it's then up to leaders to work with those valances, those instrumentalities, and those expectancies, manipulate those motivational variables in desirable ways in order to motivate employees to put forth that effort, which will then make the organization more effective and more likely to achieve organizational goals. The four behavioral styles that grow out of path goal theory are directive leadership, supportive leadership, participative leadership, and achievement oriented leadership. Directive leadership is much more that task type of orientation. You direct employees, this is what you need to do and how you need to do it. Directive approaches tend to work very well if the task is very unclear, if people don't know what the task is, they don't understand the task, they may need that type of direction to understand what they are expected to do. However, if the task is clear and employees know what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it, this sometimes will border on micromanagement. So it depends upon the situation. A supportive approach is that you provide, you're empathetic, you're supportive, you understand the frustrations of employees, and you can help alleviate some of those frustrations by being supportive and understanding, taking much more relationship, people orientation toward how you are leading. Supportive types of approaches are obviously good if tasks are frustrating, because you can help relieve some of that frustration with that empathy and with that support. The participative approach is very good if tasks are vague and if employees value self-esteem. In the participative approach, you allow employees to participate in decision making. You bring them to the decision making table, give them a seat at the decision making table, so they have that opportunity to engage in self governance and self direction. Obviously, if you have people who really value self esteem, they're going to respond very well to a participative type of an approach. They also are going to buy into these tasks if they have the opportunity to participate in the defining of those tasks as well. And then the fourth one is the achievement oriented approach. This is obviously very good for those employees who are very far along in their personal growth journey, as Chris Argyros would tell us. So, if these are people who have developed emotional intelligence, these are people who are progressing very well through their personal growth trajectory. They're kind of in that self actualization apex of the hierarchy of needs, according to Abraham Maslow. These are the people that you can then delegate a lot of responsibility to, and they're going to accept their responsibility because they are looking for opportunities to grow. They are looking for opportunities to achieve everything that they want to achieve as a human being. This is a self-actualization, this goal to try and be all that they can be. Obviously, people are going to self-select that. So you have to know your individual employees to know which employees will respond well to that type of delegation, which employees will not respond well to that type of delegation. But the basic idea here in path goal theory is that we are helping our employees to see how this, whatever they're doing, is going to help them achieve the goals that they want to achieve. The better you can clear that path for your employees between where they are now and where they want to be in terms of the accomplishment of their goals, the better you're going to be able to lead those individuals and motivate them, that will then in turn make the organization hopefully more effective. Then another theory that's also connected to Chris Argyros is Hersey and Blanchard's life cycle model. And we remember Chris Argyros telling us about this personal growth process that people go through, this trajectory as they mature, they go through this maturation process, they develop deepening interest, they develop more of a long-term time perspective, they are more connected to their organizations, more connected to their communities. That's part of this personal growth process that people go through. This life cycle model says that the way in which you lead employees will depend upon where those employees are in their personal growth trajectory. And so the model says the effectiveness of a leader's decision-making style will depend largely on the follower's level of maturity, their experience levels, their amount of emotional maturity. And so you lead people differently depending upon where they are in their personal growth process. So going back to this task versus relationship orientation. For employees that are very early on in their personal growth process, it may be more of a task orientation for the leadership. If they're well down the road, if you will, in their personal growth journey, then you might be able to lead more in a relationship oriented type of manner. So this theory kind of produces for us 4 different styles for leaders: telling, selling, participating, and delegating. So it's kind of similar to the path goal, that we've got 4 different styles that grow out of this life cycle model. Telling is obviously like directing. You tell them what to do and how to do it. Selling, you convince them that this is the most appropriate way to do this job. This is what they need to achieve, but you have to sell them on that. Participating, you allow them to participate, just like in our last slide, and then delegating for those who are very far along in their personal growth journey, that have the emotional intelligence, that have the experience, you can delegate functions to them and they will be accepting of those delegated functions. And you can then trust those employees to do a good job and that you can trust them to achieve in all these tasks and functions that have been delegated to them. So as you move from the task to relationship orientation, as you move from the very early in a personal growth journey to much later on the personal growth journey, you move through these four different leadership styles: telling, selling, participating, and delegating. But again, it's very much contingency based. It depends upon the individual and where they are in their personal growth journey. Another category of models that have been around for a long time are what are called the attribution models. Attribution models basically say that leaders will measure performance based upon essentially how well they like the employee and the track record of those employees. So they will attribute good performance to employees who have a track record of good performance. For people who have poor performance, they will attribute that to, they will blame the employees because they've always had this poor performance track record. So if a worker has a good performance record, leaders will not, if something goes wrong, blame the employee. They will rather attribute a mistake or a problem to the situation as opposed to attributing it to the individual employee. However, if a worker has a poor performance record, then if something goes wrong, it's the employee who is immediately blamed. It's not the situation, it is the employee. And so they will attribute failures either to the situation or to the employee based upon the track record of those employees. And this kind of builds into this idea of what's called a leader member exchange theory. And in leader member exchange theory, it says that every leader will develop a different relationship, a different dyadic relationship with their employees. And so every leader has a different dyad, if you will, a different dyadic relationship with each individual employee. And those dyadic relationships are going to be unique to those employees. The types of ways in which leaders interact with their employees can take the form of either what's called a high exchange relationship or a low exchange relationship. In a high exchange relationship, a high exchange dyad, that's where leaders can be open with their employees and there's a lot more communication and give and take. And that's typically done with trusted employees, with trusted subordinates. Low exchange relationships are usually developed with employees or subordinates who are not trusted by leaders. The important thing here is that, again, it's contextual, that leaders tend to develop unique dyads, unique dyadic relationships with each one of their employees, oftentimes based upon the amount of trust that they have in those employees. So how they lead is oftentimes dependent and contingent upon what they think about those individual employees. We had also talked about motivation. We talked about operant conditioning. We talked about social learning theory. Operant conditioning and social learning theory also contribute to our understanding of leadership approaches as well. Remember, operant conditioning said that their behaviors will be shaped by the consequences that accrue from those behaviors. So if a behavior leads to some type of an outcome, some type of a consequence, that will then shape that person's future behavior. That's operant conditioning. We understand that people shape their behavior through these continuous reciprocal interactions between cognitive, behavioral, and environmental influences. That behavioral patterns are learned through this process of operant conditioning and observational learning. So there is a role for leaders in helping to shape behavior based upon the consequences, positive or negative, that they incorporate within the environment to help shape those employees' behavior. So you can shape your employees' behavior through those types of consequences and through those types of outcomes. You can also shape employee behavior in this social exchange theory by leading more on social learning as opposed to operant conditioning, looking more at the cognitive processes of your employees and how those cognitive processes will then shape that employee's behavior. People learn by watching others. They learn through modeling. They learn through vicarious learning. We found that out when we talked about social learning theory. And so, what leaders must do is they have to take into account social learning and the relationship of that social learning to the internal mental states of their employees. So, if you can set up situations where you can help your employees learn how to anticipate problems, they will then be able to better avoid those problems in the future. If you involve employees in the development of goals, then you can also then enhance their acceptance of those goals and shape their behavior to um, be targeted toward the accomplishment of their goals because you've got their buy-in in these goals that they're trying to accomplish. You can help them develop their own self-management skills, help them develop their time management skills, their confidence, their expectancies, as Room would tell us. You can help them recognize how the environment connects to their behaviors. And you can help them employ things such as personal goal setting, rehearsal, self instruction, all this vicarious experiences, all this vicarious modeling. You can then help your employees develop those skills. And then by having those skills and using those skills, that will then shape the behavior of your employees. So there is an inherent role for leaders, both in terms of operant conditioning as well as social learning theory, and those kind of come together under this rubric known as social exchange theory. Understanding that behaviors can be shaped and can be altered by things that are going on in the environment. And so, if leaders can affect that environment, if they can shape that environment, they can then also shape the learning, the social learning of their employees, which will then in turn shape the behaviors that those employees engage in. So there's this direct connection between motivation literature and leadership literature in that regard. Another leadership theory that I think is an interesting one is this one known as cognitive resource utilization theory. This theory looks at the relationship between a leader's cognitive resources, such as the leader's level of intelligence, the leader's level of experience, and performance. So there's a direct relationship between stress and how leaders will respond to those stressful types of situations. In some situations, leaders can rely upon their intelligence. In some situations, they will rely upon their experience. In very low stress situations, leaders will rely upon their intelligence in order to lead their organizations. Because in a low stress situation, you don't have the same time crunch, the same time pressures to respond. You have additional time that you can think about these things, use your intelligence, use your education, use your training to then help you respond to that situation because you have the luxury of time because it's not a high stress moment. However, if it is a high stress situation, rather than relying upon intelligence, leaders will probably rely upon their experience. They will fall back upon their experience. Well, if you have lived through a similar situation in the past, you have that track record. You can then fall back on that track record and use those experiences to help you deal with this current situation. So again, it's very contingency based. Certain situations, low stress, you use intelligence, education, and training. In high stress situations where you have to react very quickly, leaders are going to rely much more upon their experiences as opposed to their intelligence. But it's all based on contingencies. It depends upon the stress level in those situations. And that's what's known as cognitive resource utilization leadership theories. But at a very basic level, as you covered in organization leadership, you know that there are some discrete categories of leadership styles that the literature tells us about. And the three very basic categories of leadership styles from the literature are things such as transactional versus transformational versus charismatic leadership. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with these different approaches to leadership. Burns gives us some good distinctions between transactional versus transformational leaders. Transactional leaders are much more along the lines of Chester Barnard. This idea that leaders need to extract contributions from their employees, and to extract the right contributions, they then have to provide the right set of incentives. You motivate your followers in transactional leadership by recognizing their needs and then providing rewards in exchange for their contributions, their performance, and their support. So it's very much of a transactional type of relationship, contributions and incentives. Transformational leaders, Burns tells us, tend to rely upon power, but they don't do it in a very controlling or centralizing way. They work to try and raise the followers' goals to this higher plane of self-actualization. So transformational leaders are the leaders that can help their employees develop as human resources, help their employees self-actualize. These transformational leaders have a talent for coupling visions of success to empowerment and motivation. A subset of this transformational leader discussion is visionary leadership, where these transformational leaders oftentimes are visionary. They bring these visions into the organization, and they can then get people to buy into these visions and can empower people to then contribute to the achievement of this vision that's been brought into the organization. We know that effective leaders will combine both transactional as well as transformational elements of leadership. Mary Parker Follett told us that with situational leadership. There's a large body of literature in political science that looks at local leaders and comes up with different categories of local leaders. There's a very famous study of big city mayors from many years ago, where the authors created different categories of mayoral leadership. And one of the categories they created was what was called the broker category. And it says some mayors are brokers. Brokers are transactional leaders. Brokers are trying to provide some people with what they want in order to get more power and more resources. But it's a very transactional relationship that broker mayors use. Transformational leadership is more akin to what they refer to as entrepreneurial mayors. There are some mayors that are entrepreneurial. Those entrepreneurial mayors are the ones who bring this vision into the city, into the organization, and then try and get everyone to work toward the achievement of that vision. And so there's real application for transactional and transformational leadership, not just in public administration, but also in political science and in urban governance. Bass also gives us this typology of transformational versus transactional leaders. Transactional leaders base their leadership on contingent based rewards. Transformational leaders base their leadership on utilizing idealized influence, intellectual stimulation, considering their employees as individuals and treating their employees as individuals, and motivating employees through inspirational appeals, through again appealing to this larger vision for the organization. So we all hope that most of the time we can be transformational leaders. I'm sure in your organizations you've worked with both transformational as well as transactional leaders. But again, it's not a one size fits all approach. In certain situations, we have the luxury, we have the political capital, we have the relationships with our employees that will allow us to be transformational in our leadership. In other situations, we have to be a little bit more transactional in order to extract the contributions that we need in order to achieve the goals of the organization. Charismatic leadership is kind of an extension from transformational leadership. And charisma is treated as a matter of the characteristics that followers attribute to their leaders. And so Leaders can lead by their personality, by their charisma, by a demonstration of their attributes and their skills. So followers follow the person rather than following the office. So in charismatic leadership, a lot of the authority resides with the individual leader as opposed to residing with the office. The good thing about charismatic leadership is it engenders a lot of strong support among followers. So it makes for very loyal followers. The downside of charismatic leadership is it's very transient, in that if that leader leaves the organization, that leader will take their charismatic leadership resources with them and leave the organization devoid of those leadership resources because the leadership resides in the person as opposed to residing in the office itself. There are two strains of charismatic leadership: attribution theory and self concept theory. The attribution theory of charismatic leadership says that followers are more likely to identify with leaders if those leaders advocate a vision that's highly discrepant from the status quo. So if you've got a leader who is willing to do something different, to not just do the same thing because this is what we've always done in the past, oftentimes followers will attribute that to good leadership. And that will be a characteristic that they connect with good leadership. Leaders who are able to act in unconventional ways. Also, that's something that people will attribute to good leadership. Leaders who demonstrate self sacrifices. Also, something that appeals to followers. Um, the type of self sacrifice that if you're going through a budget crisis and you have a leader who says, well, I'm not going to take bonus pay, or I'm not going to take any type of a compensation for additional compensation because I know there are people losing their jobs and people aren't getting raises. Obviously, that's self sacrifice. Those leaders who have confidence, obviously, are easily followed, and those who use persuasive appeals rather than authority. Charismatic leaders are very good at persuading their followers to take certain types of actions, influencing their employees through those persuasive types of appeals. So in attribution theory, people will follow a leader because they will attribute these characteristics to good leadership. These are all examples of what they consider to be good, strong leadership. Under the self concept theory of charismatic leadership, people will follow leaders who they identify with. So if they personally identify with this leader, they see themselves in this leader. Through social identification, internalization of the leader's beliefs. So if it's something that they can really kind of see themselves in this leader and they feel closely connected to this leader, then that leader can lead through self concept theory. If, however, people are following the leader because of the characteristics that leader is demonstrating are characteristics that are associated or attributed to good leadership, then they'll follow that person through what's called attribution theory. But again, the downside of charismatic leadership is that usually the persuasive power resides with the individual leader as opposed to residing with the office itself. So it tends to be relatively transient and temporary. Transformational visionary leaders are oftentimes successful at embedding a new culture into the organization. And we've talked before about the importance of organization culture for organizational effectiveness. Transformational leaders exert their influence through social structure by using basic symbols, core values, or culture of the organization. What transformational leaders can do is transformational leaders can create and embed new cultures, norms, expectations, values, and beliefs into the organization. Embedding culture into an organization is obviously important, but it's also very difficult, very resource, and very time consuming. Many of you in your assignments have talked about one of the things that needs to happen in the organization is you need a new culture in the organization. And this is why you need a new culture. It is possible to embed a new culture, but it's a gradual, protracted, difficult process. Now, just as a reminder, when we talked about organization culture, there are essentially three different levels to organization culture. At the very superficial, shallow level, we have what we call our artifacts. Artifacts are tangible examples of the culture of the organization. So tangible examples of what the organization, how the organization operates on a daily basis. So we identified artifacts as things such as meeting agendas, meeting minutes, policy and procedure manuals. Those are very tangible artifacts of organization culture. We can see how the organization does its business and behaves on a daily basis at that very shallow level. At a deeper level, we have the second type of indicator of culture, which we call the espoused values. Espoused values are things such as the mission statement of the organization's code of ethics, code of conduct. Those are values that are espoused. Those are values that the organization's telling you, this is who we are, this is what we value, these are our expectations. So they're espoused because they are told to society. So you can find these relatively easily. At the deepest level of culture are these basic underlying assumptions, these assumptions that everyone has in the organization about things such as how we treat each other as human beings. If you don't have a civility code, how you treat people in a collegial and civil manner. We all expect that we will respect each other and that we'll treat each other in a professional and collegial manner. We may not go out there and talk about it. We may not maybe have our espoused values, but it's something we've all internalized. It's something that we all believe and oftentimes is unspoken. That's why those basic underlying assumptions tend to be at a much deeper level of organization culture. So leaders can communicate culture in a variety of different ways. Leaders can communicate organization culture through symbols, physical objects, settings, roles within the organization to convey information about the values and basic assumptions of that organization. They can convey it through language, slogans, songs, jargon. Together we accomplish more is a slogan that embeds culture into the organization. Narratives, these are your stories that are told in the organization, legends, sagas, myths that convey information about the organization's history and practices. And then practices and events, repeated practices and special events that transmit important assumptions and values, things like rites and ceremonies. And so if we have an employee of the month ceremony, that's a practice that communicates culture, that says this person exhibited this behavior, and obviously it's something that we value as an organization because we are having this employee of the month ceremony. So there are lots of ways leaders can communicate culture to members of the organization. There are also discrete ways in which leaders can embed a new culture into an organization. So you can embed new culture into an organization by making it clear what you as a leader will monitor, ignore, measure, or control. That will then serve as a signal to people in the organization that this is a behavior that is going to be paid attention to by leadership. So obviously it's a behavior that's important to the organization's culture. How you react to critical incidents and organizational crises in ways that send appropriate cultural messages. So if there's a crisis situation, the way you react to that crisis will also communicate to your employees the culture of the organization. If you panic in a crisis situation, that's obviously not going to communicate great expectations in terms of organization culture. Leaders who practice deliberate role modeling, teaching, and coaching. This goes back to social exchange and social learning theory. Leaders that establish effective criteria for advancement and punishment. These criteria need to be clear, they need to be observable, and they need to be understood by employees so employees know what behaviors are punished, what behaviors are then rewarded and subject for advancement. Leaders that coordinate organization design and structure with their cultural messages, making sure the way the organization is designed, the structure of the organization is in alignment with the culture of the organization. So if you want to have a participatory type of situation, a participative organization, Mary Parker Follett democratic organization, you're probably going to have more of a flat type of hierarchy or a flatter hierarchy than your classic Weberian tall hierarchy. That type of structure would then communicate more ability to participate for your employees in decision making. Coordinating organizational systems and procedures with cultural messages. And so, if the primary thrust of our culture of our organization is serving our citizens, serving our consumers, but we have strict policy and procedure manuals that sometimes get in the way of serving those consumers, that's obviously going to be a problem. So, coordinate your procedures with your cultural messages. This next one's a really important one that I find kind of fascinating. Designing physical space to communicate culture. So if we want to have a much more open culture where people can communicate with each other and people can exchange ideas, we may want our physical space to reflect that as well. And so, when I was in my district, the second floor of the district office was the finance folks. That was our finance department. No one really went into the finance department unless you work there. The finance department was really kind of a balkanized department where everyone was in their own little cubicle, their own little office doing their own thing. So the leader, the superintendent, wanted to make this a much more open type of culture. So she redesigned the physical space so that you didn't have the walls going up to the ceiling. You had lower walls. You had some shared space that people could share in doing work together, shared workspaces, and that type of physical structure can really have an impact upon the culture of the organization. In urban politics, one of the great examples of this is the Pruitt-Igoe housing project in St. Louis. The Pruitt-Igoe housing project, the way in which it was designed physically in terms of physical space, had a very negative impact upon culture, had a very negative impact upon how the residents viewed their housing, how they viewed their home. Pruitt-Igoe was a very tall housing project. It was a housing project that had been designed whereby to save money, elevators didn't stop at every floor. And so elevators would only stop at even number floors. And so if you lived at an odd number floor, if you lived on the 11th floor, you either had to go take the elevator to the 10th floor, walk up to the stairs to the 11th floor, or take it to the 12th floor and walk down the steps to the 11th floor. Things like that type of physical design really led people to not enjoy where they were living. And so therefore they didn't really feel that they needed to take care of where they were living. And it was just a good example of how physical space can have an impact upon culture. Employing stories about events and people, again, can help embed and communicate that culture. Developing formal statements of organizational philosophy, so it's very clear what the philosophy of the organization is, and everyone can buy into that philosophy. And approaching cultural leadership as comprehensive organizational change. If a leader, a transformational leader, is going to really devote themselves to changing the culture of the organization, this is a holistic type of change. This is something that is comprehensive. This is something that can just not be half done. This is something that needs to be followed through on. It does require a lot of resources. It does require a lot of good faith. It requires a lot of political capital. And some leaders don't come into the organization with enough capital in order to implement these organizational cultural changes. They don't have the capital to make these cultural changes, then those changes are obviously going to be a failure. Hopefully, our leaders are going to be what we consider to be entrepreneurial leaders. They're going to be leaders who have high leadership skill level, but they're also leaders who are very committed to the organization and the programs implemented by that organization. Entrepreneurial leaders tend to have a high skill level, high commitment to the organization and programmatic goals. Those leaders that tend to have high skill levels but are not very committed to programmatic goals of the organization tend to be much more generalist in nature. Those that are low on both skill as well as commitment, those tend to be what we would consider to be our administrative survivors. They're just trying to get by on a daily basis. They're not really trying to make any major changes to our organization. Those who have a high commitment to the goals of the organization but have low skill levels, those tend to be falling into more the zealot category, our good friend Tony Downs told us. These are your third category of your ideologies. These are your zealots. But where we hope our leaders will be is we hope they will be entrepreneurial and that they'll have a high skill level leadership, but they'll also have a strong commitment to the organization as well as the goals of the program that we're implementing as an organization. For leaders to be effective and to contribute to the effectiveness of their organizations, leaders need to learn how to manage groups in the organization. They need to learn how to manage conflict in the organization, and they need to learn to manage communication within the organization as well. So effective leaders understand groups. They understand why groups form. They understand the role that these groups play in terms of impacting the organization. And they understand what they can do and the strategies that they can use in order to manage groups productively. So we know that groups can be good and groups can be bad. There can be advantages and there can be disadvantages to groups in organizations. Let me show you in text chat. Let me scroll up a little bit. Cursor's not reading. So you said this, the notion of physical space is interesting because a lot of public administration spaces, government organizations are housed in older buildings and require resources to update. Money for infrastructure is limited in many cases, poses a challenge to employee engagement. And I think that's absolutely correct. A lot of our government organizations are located within older buildings. Sometimes they're located in buildings that are not owned by the government. They're leasing space in privately owned buildings, which then makes it difficult for them to have the flexibility to make these changes to physical space. Sometimes they're in buildings that are so old that any of those changes could certainly release asbestos or things such as that. And so it does make it more very costly and very difficult to make some of those physical changes. And so I think you're right. It's going to take an investment of resources and the willingness on the part of the leadership as well as budget makers to put those resources behind these changes to physical space, or else you're just simply not going to be able to do that. But I agree with you, Cynthia. I think that the relationship between physical space and culture and things such as employee engagement, employee empowerment, employee motivation, I think it's a really interesting body of literature and a really interesting topic. And it can have a big impact upon the organization's culture. So these groups can be either positive or they can be negative. Some of the positives of groups and organizations, groups can sometimes outperform individuals because you have the collective availability of talents and resources. So if you put people together into a group, they all bring talent and they bring their abilities into that group. And so the collection of talent and abilities can be greater than one person's talent and abilities. We know that group dynamics can motivate individuals. Elton Mayo taught us that with his Hawthorne experiments, where he showed us how putting people in groups and those group dynamics can actually make people work harder and be more motivated to work harder in order to make the group look good. We know that interaction between employees can foster knowledge, it can foster creativity. We know that in terms of democratic governance, again, with Follett. Some of the negative aspects of groups can stifle individual opinions. We can have a situation of groupthink, and we'll talk about groupthink, which I'm sure you've talked about before, but we'll talk about it again in just a second. Groups can encourage the wrong culture. Sometimes groups can develop their own culture that is not in alignment with the greater organizational culture. We also know with groups, you can then end up having free riders, and you have people who are getting the benefits without putting forth the effort to contribute to the creation of those benefits. We do breakout groups in this class, but in my courses, I never have graded group assignments because sometimes it's difficult because groups oftentimes do have free riders, and it's kind of a natural inclination of human nature is that if you believe that people are, for the most part, rational, self-interested actors, then they are going to take actions that will maximize the benefits while minimizing their costs and minimizing their risks. However, the literature tells us that effective leaders can have a positive impact upon group behavior. But one of the things that you're very welcome for that, Janine. Yeah, that's something that always drove me crazy when I was in graduate school. is having group assignments. And I really think that your grade should be based upon your individual efforts, but then, you still work in groups for that type of interaction, but not really get graded on that work. So yeah, kind of based on my own experiences. So, but one thing that leaders really need to be concerned about with groups is obviously this idea of groupthink. And you're probably familiar with groupthink. Groupthink, attributed to Janice, attributed to Janice, is this idea that group members will get together to try and minimize conflict and reach a consensus without ever really critically analyzing and evaluating ideas. That they will try and depress independent thought for the purpose of achieving cohesion among the group members. And groupthink really is very much of a decision-making shortcut where you try and avoid any dissenting opinions, and your primary goal is to make decisions as a group in a consensus without really critically analyzing some of the negative aspects of those potential decisions. Janice, spelled correctly, then tells us how leaders can go about avoiding groupthink. Leaders can encourage members to act as critical evaluators. You can assign two or more groups to come to a decision independently, so that you'll see if you have two groups coming to a decision independently, but then coming to the same decision, that gives you a little bit of faith that maybe that decision is an appropriate one and is not just due to the pressures of groupthink. Requiring members of the group to consult with outsiders. These are like things like external evaluations. And so whenever we have someone, my university, going up for early tenure and promotion, it's not just the departmental committee that reviews it. There must be external evaluators to review it as well to try and avoid that groupthink within that departmental committee. Accept criticism of your own actions, break the group into subgroups at key points, invite outside experts, hold those last chance sessions to give participants every opportunity possible to air their points of view. And then my favorite, assigning a member to play devil's advocate. So you have one member of the group who will play devil's advocate and say, well, how about this? Or, well, this may not be the best idea because what if this it actually be kind of fun to play devil's advocate in a group, but those are all strategies to try and avoid groupthink, because groupthink is a kind of a natural herd type of mentality that tends to happen for social reasons within organizations. But the management of groups is obviously an important role for leaders to play so that you can extract those positive aspects of groups while minimizing their negative consequences. We also know that effective leaders are good at effectively managing communication within the organization. So effective leaders understand how information is passed along in the organizational structure. They understand how communication processes impact outcomes. They understand who has access to information, who should, and then who does have access to information. And they understand the roles played by members in transmission of communication. Does everyone have an equal role in the transmission of communication, transmission of information? So here are some problems that occur in terms of communication within an organization. We can have barriers to effective communication, things such as a lack of feedback. When we have one-way communication, in which the receiver provides no return of information about whether and with what effect the information came across. One-way communication means a lack of feedback. Oftentimes, that's a problem with effective communication. Noise in the communication process. I think we've all experienced this before. Interference with the message during its transmission, ranging from actual physical noise or distortion to distractions or interference from the presence of others. Personal biases, that's a big one. It's difficult for us as human beings to recognize our own personal implicit biases and to address those biases or past experiences. So I would say noise in the communication process will make it difficult for us to transmit the information we're trying to transmit. Misuse of language, excessively vague, inaccurate, inflammatory, emotional, positive, or negative language. And then listening deficiencies, receivers listening inattentively, passively, or not at all. We all know the problem with email communication. Email communication is very easy, it's very convenient, it's very efficient, but we also know it's difficult to discern tone in email communication. And so sometimes there is a misinterpretation of language used in email communication, and that can be a barrier to effective communication as well. It's always good when you're sending out an email to take a beat and let it rest for a minute and review it before you actually send that email out. Barriers to effective communication between groups: when two groups define a conflict between them as a win or lose conflict, a zero-sum type of game. When one or both groups seek to aggrandize their own power and emphasize only their own goals and needs, when threats are used, when they disguise their true positions, and so on and so on. There are also communication distortions within public organizations, distorted perceptions, inaccurate perceptions of information, as we had talked about before, erroneous translation, errors of abstraction, lack of congruence, distrusted sources. If we don't trust the source of the information, we obviously are not going to trust the information itself. Too much use of jargon. This is a problem in some of our organizations that have very technical functions. When they try and communicate with elected officials, or they try and communicate with citizens outside the organization, those recipients of that information will get bogged down in a lot of jargon that they may not understand. Manipulating and withholding information. This is this moral hazard that is part and parcel of the principal-agent relationship. When agents have the information, they can decide selectively what information to provide, what information to withhold, perhaps distortion of some information. That's this moral hazard that comes along with this principal-agent relationship. So leaders have a lot to worry about in terms of communication in organizations and how to best manage both horizontal as well as vertical communication chains. And then effective leaders are also then effective at managing and controlling conflict. Conflict is a natural part of organizations. Whenever we get a lot of people together working in close proximity to each other with all these different vested interests and all these different opinions, conflict is a natural outgrowth of any democratic organization. The way to eliminate conflict would be to eliminate different opinions, and then you've eliminated your democratic organization. But conflict is not always bad. Conflict can be productive if it's managed correctly, but it can be disastrous if it's ignored or mismanaged by leaders and managers. Conflict can emerge from a lot of different sources. From bad communication, primarily, is where we see a lot of conflict coming from. And the way out of conflict usually emphasizes the establishment, going back to our previous slide, of effective communication methods. So we know we're going to have conflict in our organizations. And so as leaders, we need to be able to manage and control that conflict. This is natural. Madisonian systems will tell us this, that because we have separation of powers, because we have a vertical system of separation of powers and federalism, there's always going to be conflict in government, both outside as well as inside of organizations. Conflict can exist within a person, such as with role conflict, role ambiguity. Conflict can exist between people. Conflict can also exist between groups. Conflict can be horizontal, people situated at similar positions in the organizational structure. Conflict can also then be vertical across different levels of the organization. Conflict, as we said before, can come from bad communication. It can come from people having different goals, people having different values, different cultures within the organization, and different organizational priorities. So in order to manage conflict, we have to understand the stages of conflict and how conflict kind of progresses from the latent stage to manifest conflict. So in the latent conflict stage, the conditions are right for conflict to occur. So this is where conflict is waiting to happen. So if we have differing perceptions about what this program is supposed to do, or differing expectations in terms of the performance levels of different employees, that establishes these conditions where conflict is probably going to occur. But it's still latent. It hasn't really occurred yet. The perceived conflict stage is where people sense conflict. So they kind of feel the conflict, they sense it, but they really they try and downplay it and deny it. So they think conflict is probably here, but we're not really going to think much about it. We're going to ignore it, put our head in the sand, and hope it just goes away. Once that conflict starts to provide people with discomfort, tension, anger, that's when it moves into the third stage, which is the felt stage, where people are actually experiencing that conflict. Then, once that conflict breaks into open warfare, then there's a winner and a loser in that conflictual situation. That's the manifest conflict level. This is kind of your last stage, your last attempt to intervene. And if you don't intervene at this point in time, this is where the conflict becomes very destructive. So this is kind of your last ditch effort to try and deal with this conflict at the manifest conflict stage. If you can deal with it at the felt conflict stage or the perceived conflict stage, that's all the better. But the very last time you can really deal with it is in this manifest conflict stage. Once the conflict is over with and there's a winner and there is a loser, that's when we start to see things like conflict breeding more conflict. Because those who are the quote unquote losers in the conflict will obviously be disaffected, they'll be dissatisfied, and then they will be more inclined to engage in conflict in the future to kind of restore some of that lost prestige. Those who win the conflict may then also be more inclined to engage in conflict in the future because it worked out for them now. Maybe it'll work out for them again in the future. So conflict tends to breed more conflict, and then that conflict kind of takes on a life of its own. And that's when you have some major challenges to the effectiveness of the organization. So again, the last place that you can really address this conflict is at the manifest stage, but if you can address it earlier on at the perceived or the felt stage, avoid getting to that manifest conflict stage, then you can avoid the conflict aftermath. People respond to conflict differently. And so there are 5 basic responses to conflict within an organization. And those 5 different conflict responses are going to be based upon somebody's concern for their own goals versus their concern for the goals of the group. So if you have someone who's not really concerned about their own goals, they're not concerned about the goals of the group, they're going to engage in the response of avoidance. Leave me alone. I don't want to be involved in this. I'm out. Obviously, not a great way to respond to a conflict. For those who have a very high concern for their own goals, but a low concern for the goals of the group, that's where the response is going to be a competitive response. This is your zero-sum game. I'm going to try and lose, and I'm going to try and win. And when I win, by definition, it means you are going to lose. So it's a competition in order to resolve this conflict. The bottom right is accommodation. You have a high concern for the goals of the group, a low concern for your own goals, so you will give in. You will accommodate the group. You will just give in to what the group wants. The middle is compromise. It's kind of halfway on both. So you're halfway on concern for group goals, halfway on concern for your own goals. So you are willing to negotiate and try and compromise, kind of meet everyone halfway. Obviously, the best response is going to be the collaborative response for people who have a high concern for their own goals, a high concern for group goals, finding a way to try and take all of these opinions and all these ideas and synthesize them into an approach to resolving the conflict where we basically all win. This is, not to mention Mary Parker Fall. Again, I've talked about her a lot tonight, but this is what Mary Parker Fall would refer to as integration. Integration is better than domination. Integration is better than compromise and negotiation. Integration is the more appropriate approach because we are synthesizing into a new way of dealing with the problem and resolving the conflict that everyone can buy into. So not just one party wins and one party loses. But obviously, conflict can tear apart organizations and can keep organizations from being effective. Leadership in the public sector, and we're going to wrap this up in just a second, but leadership in the public sector is all obviously different than leadership in the private sector. In the public sector, we have unique situations such as the number of groups and individuals and the variation and heterogeneity among those groups and those individuals that are seeking to influence decision making makes it more difficult to lead our public organizations. There's also a very high frequency of power sharing situations. As we know, leaders in the public sector are limited in terms of the types of things that they can do to manage and lead their employees through, career civil service regulations, collective bargaining agreements. So there's a lot of power sharing that occurs. Sometimes that power sharing is what leads to then conflict. There are more people in the public sector with more diverse backgrounds, cultures, and interests than you would have perhaps in the private sector because of our striving in the public sector to achieve social justice and social equity and a representative bureaucracy. The rules, regulations, clearances, and reporting requirements, coupled with pressures for accountability, will have impacts upon the decision-making process of leaders. We have a lot of these rules and regulations we have to adhere to in the public as compared to the private sector. Our goals are obviously much harder to define and measure in the public sector, which then has implications for the measurement of performance. So effective leaders are effective at rewarding and penalizing certain types of performance behaviors. That's going to be difficult to do if we don't have clear performance expectations. That's going to be difficult for us to have clear performance expectations if we don't have clear goals. And the tasks in the public sector tend to be much more service oriented and information intense than what we might see over in the private sector. We get much more into what Thompson would refer to as that intensive type of technology in the public sector as compared to the log linked or the more mediating technology that you oftentimes see in the private sector. And this is a justification for why I'm sure you learn in your organization leadership class, why we have this burgeoning field of literature looking at leadership in public organizations. So rather than just borrowing leadership studies from the private sector, we have in public administration developed our own database of research on leadership in public organizations because leading a public organization is obviously unique and different than leading in a private organization. So that's our coverage of leadership in effective organizations. Again, I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, probably talk more than I should have, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it just because I know you're just coming off not long ago an organization leadership course. But it is important that leadership has this impact upon the effectiveness of the organization that we can't ignore it. And it's something that we did need to cover. Rather than doing a breakout group session at this point, what I would propose is it's 7:17. So I would propose we take about a 10-minute break. And then after the break, we'll turn our attention to our final set of slides for this course, where we'll talk about some of the necessary conditions for organizations to be effective, which is really a nice way of kind of wrapping everything up and summarizing everything that we've talked about over the past 7 weeks. So let's take a break. We'll say until let's say 7:30. I give it a couple extra minutes, but come back at 7:30, and that 7:30 will be in the home stretch, and I'll wrap up all the information with this discussion of what makes organizations effective. I can probably do that within half an hour, and we can still be done by 8 o'clock. If we get through all that information tonight, then next week we can just reserve that time for you to work on your chosen solution paper. So take a break, come on back at 7:30, and we will do our summation. Okay, it's 7:30, so welcome back, and we will finish up this last part of information and hopefully have it all done by 8 o'clock, and then we will move onward and upward. My computer was giving me a little trouble sharing this, but it's up there now, so I think we're good to go. So let's talk, just wrap up everything by talking about some of the research on effective organizations and what the research tells us about some of the conditions that are necessary for organizations to achieve effectiveness. Because at the end of the day, that's what this course is all about. So one person we'll look at is Stephen Gold. Stephen Gould's a very famous public administration scholar. You may have run into him before, working primarily, or he did work primarily out of sunny Albany in the Nelson Rockefeller Center. He did a study looking at 10 different successful organizations, 5 of those organizations public and 5 of those private. And he found the following characteristics that were common to those 10 successful organizations. Number one, they were all learning organizations. The organizations all supported learning, they supported risk taking and measurement of work. They all had a very focused mission. They emphasized clarifying and communicating their mission both internally as well as externally to the organization. They all represented a nurturing community in that they had a supportive organizational culture. And then fourth, they all had enabling leadership. They had leaders who facilitated learning, communication, flexibility, and the development of a vision for the organization. So they were all learning, focused mission, nurturing community, and enabling leadership. And those are the common characteristics that he found in those successful organizations across both sectors. The research also shows us that effective organizations tend to have high levels of effective relationships with their oversight authorities. So agencies that have good relationships with the legislature, the executive, and the judicial branch, those organizations tend to be relatively effective. Organizations that have legislative, executive, and judicial authorities that are attentive to the needs of the organization, that are demanding of the organization in terms of productivity and effectiveness, that are supportive of the organizations, that provide the necessary resources to the organizations, and authorities that are also able and willing to delegate responsibilities to those agencies. Those are the agencies that tend to be most effective. Research also shows us, a lot of this is no surprise to us, but effective organizations also tend to demonstrate effective relationships with other stakeholders other than oversight authorities. So organizations that have favorable public opinion, general public support. Organizations that have multiple influential constituent and client groups that they can mobilize if necessary. So if a budget cut is coming down the road and they see that budget cut coming, they can mobilize these influential constituent groups to push back on those budget cuts. Effective relationships with partners and suppliers. So they have effective management of contractors in the contracting process. And we know just how detailed and specific the contracting process and procurement process is here in California. Effective utilization of technology and resources, and effective negotiation of the networks in which they operate. We've talked a lot about the importance of governing networks and how effective organizations know how to navigate those networks in the delivery of goods and services. Research also shows us that organizations tend to perform more effectively when they have responsive autonomy in relation to political oversight and influence, that they are politically responsive. They are responsive to their overseers. They provide the information necessary, and they do it in a timely manner, and they have the trust of their overseers. That's when they tend to be more effective. Organizations that have mission balance, that have an attractive mission, also tend to be more effective. When they have missions that are difficult but still achievable. We talked about difficult missions, difficult goals, and how those can actually motivate employees in the organization. When they have missions that are clear and understandable. When they have missions that are worthy, worthwhile, and legitimate. When they have missions that are interesting and exciting, when they have missions that are important and influential. And this last one is really important, when they have missions that are distinctive, missions that can distinguish this organization from other public organizations. If they don't have a distinctive mission, then it's likely elected officials, budget makers are going to look at that organization and say, well, you're the same as this organization, so why have duplication of two separate organizations? So you need to have a distinctive mission statement. And as we had just finished talking about before the break, they need to have a strong organization culture and a culture that is directly linked to the mission of the organization. But what else? As we talked about tonight, effective organizations tend to have effective leadership. They have stable leadership. They have multiplicity of leadership in that they have a cadre of leaders or teams of leaders at multiple levels in the organization. They have leadership that is committed to the mission of the organization. They have leadership that is committed to effective goal setting in relation to task and mission accomplishment. And they have leadership that's effective at coping with political and administrative constraints. So obviously, effective leadership is elemental to an effective organization. Effective organizations also tend to have effective task design. They have intrinsically motivating tasks, tasks that spur interest and growth and responsibility and service and mission accomplishment. When they do have extrinsic rewards for task accomplishment, such as pay or benefits, promotion, working conditions, that these extrinsic rewards are distributed in a just way, as we had talked about with distributive justice in a previous class, and that these extrinsic rewards have balance with employees, that they matter to employees, and that the distribution of those rewards are linked to measurable performance activities. Effective organizations have effective development of human resources. A lot of people are talking about the problem of a lack of onboarding in their organization, lack of effective recruitment, a lack of effective hiring processes. We need to have effective recruitment, selection, placement, training, and development. The values and preferences among recruits and members that support task and mission motivation. So you're hiring people into the organization that share the values of the organization and align well with the mission of the organization as well. Effective public organizations also tend to have high levels of professionalism among the members of the organization. They have high levels of special knowledge and skills that are directly related to the task and mission accomplishment. They have members who are committed to the task and mission accomplishment, high levels of public service professionalism. It's no mistake that NASPA now requires, among their 5 universal required competencies, the ability to articulate a public sector perspective. But they understand what public service is, and they understand the unique nature of the public sector and public service. These effective organizations have high levels of motivation among their members, hence the reason why we spend an entire week talking about employee motivation. High levels of public service motivation among their members. They're there to serve the public. They're kind of the statespeople, as Tony Downs would call them. They have high levels of mission motivation, and they have high levels of task motivation as well. So you can kind of see all these elements that the literature says are necessary for effectiveness in an organization track back very well to each week of this course. Motivation, which we spent a week on, leadership, which we spent a week on, mission development and goal development, which we spent a week on, public service, the difference between public and private organizations, which we spent time about looking at. And so you can kind of see how this course was all built around trying to emphasize those essential elements of effective organizations. So we know we went through at the federal level and in some state levels as well, this reinvention of government movement. And this happened, back in the Osborne and Gabler years in the 90s and the 2000s, where we decided we were going to try and reinvent government and reinvent government agencies to make them more effective. And so Osborne and Gabler and others provide us with some strategies that we could use to reinvent government and to make government organizations more effective. Things such as what they refer to as catalytic government. In catalytic government, we are leveraging government authority and resources by using private and nonprofit sector resources and energies through strategies such as either privatization or public-private partnerships. Government organization should be in the business of steering rather than rowing, meaning that governments should provide the direction, but when there is daily work to be done, sometimes that daily work can be done by nonprofit or private organizations, but the direction is being provided by government sector, by government organizations, what they call catalytic government. Another strategy is community-owned government, empowering local communities and groups to be able to have some control over what organizations are doing through things such as community policing or residential control of public housing. Introducing competition for our governmental organizations, introduce more competition between government and private organizations, as well as competition within government and between private organizations through strategies such as competitive contracting, school choice, voucher programs, all this introduction of competition in order to make government organizations more efficient and more effective. So it's not just this monopoly. And we know that when governments have a monopoly, there can be some negative impacts upon efficiency and effectiveness. And mission-driven government, making sure that what we are doing in an organization is based upon our mission, that everything flows back to our mission, and the actions that we're taking in order to further our mission rather than just to abide by rules and procedures. So having flexible budgeting procedures. Some organizations are using types of budgets where they're not necessarily doing complete fund segregation, and they're doing budgeting whereby you can shift, have more flexibility in changing expenditure codes and moving items from one fund to another. That type of flexibility can help you better achieve your mission as opposed just to trying to adhere to rules and regulations. More flexible personnel rules and personnel procedures, broader, more flexible pay categories instead of the very stringent pay grades and bands that we have in our current position classification systems. Customer-driven government. This was a major thrust with the reinvention of government, as you probably know, giving customers of public programs and services more influence over them, really focusing on the quality of not just the outputs, but the outcomes, the consequences of those programs and those goods and services that we are delivering. Making sure that the consequences that accrue to our citizens/consumers actually meet their needs, their wants, needs, and their desires. Enterprising government, finding ways to earn money through user fees, maybe reducing our reliance upon traditional tax-based sources of revenue. We saw that happen here in California in the wake of Proposition 13. We've seen a lot of local governments shift away from reliance upon the property tax and move more toward a reliance upon user charges and user fees and other types of non-tax sources of revenue. Prior to 1978, the primary revenue source for local governments in California was certainly property taxes. Now, if you look at the state as a whole, for the average California city, and that's not as true here in Southern California, a lot of our cities are still more reliant upon property taxes than in other areas of the state. But for the average city in California, the major revenue category is no longer property taxes, it's now user fees and user charges. Anticipatory government, preventing problems before they occur rather than curing them after they do, through the use of strategic planning, long-range budgeting, interdepartmental planning and budgeting, innovative prevention programs and environmental protection, predictive policing in terms of crime and things such as that. Decentralized government, decentralizing government activities through things like relaxing rules and hierarchical controls, through participatory management, innovative management, employee development, labor management partnerships and initiatives. A lot of organizations have met with a great deal of success with what we call the LMIs, the labor management initiatives. Market-oriented government, using economic market mechanisms to achieve public policy goals and deliver public services, user fees, pollution taxes, tax credits, vouchers, and results-oriented government, placing more emphasis on outcomes rather than inputs through greater investment in performance measures, including using them in budgeting and evaluation systems. So we have gotten much more sophisticated in the way in which we do budgeting in the public sector. So now in our organizations, we have moved away from a traditional simple line item budget, and now a lot of organizations are incorporating performance indicators in a performance-based type of approach to the way in which we are doing budgeting. So we've got all these different strategies that we can use to try and reform our public organizations for the primary purpose of trying to make them more effective. All of these reforms, though, kind of share some commonalities. Some of the commonalities among these reforms are number one, contingency-based management and leadership. One of the things that we have seen is we are no longer in the search for effective organizations focusing on the magic bullet. We're no longer focusing on here is the one size fits all approach that can make all of our organizations effective. We're no longer in that type of a classical school approach. Now we understand the importance of contingencies. We understand how we lead according to contingencies and context. We understand how our culture is based upon the contingency of the context in which we are facing what we are facing as a leader. We understand how leaders use experience versus intelligence based upon the context of the situation, and so on and so on. So, in seeking to make our organizations more effective, we base our decisions much more on the context of the situation. And my favorite answer, it depends. Much more employee involvement. A lot of the reforms are based upon involving our employees more in terms of self-determination, in terms of self-direction. So doing more participatory type of management of our organizations, doing more delegating as opposed to telling or selling or directive. So much more involvement of our employees, much more strategic thinking, much more of an emphasis placed upon the development of these long-range strategic plans, and then action plans to help us achieve those long-term goals and objectives. So we're thinking much more strategically as organizations. And also thinking very strategically in terms of partnerships as well. So who are some of the partners that we can work with to more effectively and efficiently deliver these goods and services as opposed to just delivering them by one agency or one organization? Effectively using and leveraging resources, understanding the importance of the external environment. And the better an organization can leverage the resources in its external environment, the more likely it is to be effective. Going back to this idea of open systems theory, systems resource approach to measuring effectiveness, if we are able to bring in these new energies and these new resources from our environment, we can then stave off what the natural systems theorists call as the entropy process. And it can help our organizations grow and our organizations thrive. The basic, if you want to look at the thread that ties all this together, is this idea of contingency-based management. The search for the magic bullet is dead. In finding out how we can make our organizations more effective, we have to take into account all of the contingencies of the situation that we are currently facing. We need to know what the current culture is like. We need to know what types of challenges the organization is facing from its external environment. We need to know how engaged and how motivated our employees are. We need to know how clear and how important and how worthwhile our mission is, how our strategic plan, how clear our goals are that we've come up with in our strategic plan. We have to take into account all those different contingencies, and what works well in one organization makes one organization effective may not benefit another organization. I think that's a much more realistic way of looking at organizational effectiveness. The downside is obviously it's a much more complicated way as well. That once we are taking into account all these contingencies, it's more complicated to study organizations and learn ways to make them more effective than if we did just have that one magic bullet like Weber and Taylor and all the classical authors told us. So it makes it more difficult to achieve effectiveness, but I think it's a more realistic way of viewing effectiveness in our organizations. So I think this is kind of a good way to kind of sum up everything that we've talked about throughout our course up to this point in time. Again, our entire focus was on trying to make our organizations more effective and then affording you the opportunity to look at your organization or an organization you want to focus upon, identify what is inhibiting effectiveness, and then come up with some practical solutions to try and solve that problem that is inhibiting the effectiveness of your organization. The hope is that maybe the solutions that you have chosen and that you will advocate for in your chosen solution paper, maybe these are realistic solutions that can actually go to your organization and can be put in place by your organization. And that's what gives us our nexus between all these theories we've talked about and the actual practice of making public organizations more effective. And that is it. And that is all the information we typically cover in this course throughout the course of a semester. Do you have any questions, any observations, anything at all in our last 5 minutes or so together tonight? Hopefully this all, as we say, is clear as a muddy river for you, but hopefully it all kind of fits together really well. You all good?
Yes.
I had one question. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. You have a question? I don't know who that was.
Oh, sorry, it was me. So
Christian.
for the final paper, I know you mentioned or in the beginning of the class that the pages could be shorter, I guess. You just want us to just talk about our solutions and not brief, but just go straight to the solution.
Yep. Yeah, you can go straight for the chosen solution paper. All you need to do is just give me the one paragraph reminding me about what the issue or the problem is that you are addressing, and then just say here are the solutions solution that I have selected, and this is why this is the most appropriate solution to address this problem. And that's it. I mean, it's as straightforward and as basic as that. I really want it to be functional for you. I really want it to be something that perhaps you can take back to your organization and hopefully in the future maybe even implement. So yeah, you got it. Just here's the solution, and this is why it's the most appropriate solution.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure. Well, since we have covered all of our information, then the good news is that next week we won't have to have a Zoom session next Tuesday. So we will just afford you that time to work on your chosen solution paper. I will be available. So if as you're working on it, if you have any questions, you can send me an email. Happy to answer questions you may have. The chosen solution paper then is due by midnight on May 17th. But as always, you get it done early. Feel free to submit it early. I will be reviewing them on a rolling basis. And all you have left is your chosen solution paper and then Canvas number 6, I think it is, we're up to, where you just share with your colleagues your chosen solution and why it's the most appropriate one. And then that's it. And then we are done as a class. All righty. Okay, well, it's been wonderful working with everyone. Thanks for being here over these past 7 weeks. I hope it has been helpful to you. I hope the content's been helpful to you and hopefully to your organization as well. I will certainly be around even when the class ends. And so if you need anything at all, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to be there to help out. Recommendations or anything you need, I'm there. So, all right. Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Take care. Have a great week. I'll talk to you hopefully soon.
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Hong. Thank you.
Thank you.